Hi, this is Corey Johnston, and today's lesson is going to begin in the 12th verse of the first chapter in the book of Philippians. We're going to try and make it all the way to the end, but before we do that, we want to establish the context. Now, Philippi, in our present historical circumstance, we tend to think of Christianity as a white man's religion, and that is what it has became, but it did not start that way. So 60% of the Roman Empire, which would have been Christianized beginning with Constantine, is actually in the hands of Muslim people at this time, and it has survived primarily as a Western religion, even though it began in the East. But the city of Philippi, which was founded and named after the father of Alexander the Great, the Macedonian king, was located in Macedonia, and it witnessed the original expansion of the church into the European continent. And Paul personally evangelized it in the year 50 AD. We can read of the exciting chapter in Acts 16, which involves a woman named Lydia and ends with the conversion of his jailer, who is when an earthquake essentially allows Paul and his imprisoned companions to escape. They end up converting the jailer after the fact. And he would have returned there some 6 years later on his third missionary journey. And Philippi was actually a city of some significance in the ancient world. It was around there that the forces of Octavian triumphed. The united Caesarian faction of the forces of Octavian, later known as Caesar Augustus and Mark Antony, who were originally allies before they fought for the remains of the Roman empires amongst themselves. But they defeated the forces of Brutus and Cassius in their struggle for the control of the Roman Empire. And it was also a commercially vibrant city and quite cultural as far as Macedonia was concerned. So that being said, we're going to open with the 12th verse, which reads, and the beginning of this, it starts as a preamble, then an expression of thanksgiving, and then Paul has a praise, and what comes after this is derived from a famous incarnational hymn. I did one on that. You can type in Corey Johnston, Philippians 2, 1 through 12. But now we're going to turn to the 12th verse, which reads, "And I want you to know, brethren, that what has befallen me has turned out for the advancement of the good news." So this is a prison epistle. This was written some 6 years after his most recent visit to Macedonia. He was imprisoned in Rome 2 times, one from the years 60 to 62 AD. That's where the book of Acts leads off while he's awaiting trial for it. And the second, but he has an awareness that he will not be there forever. But his second imprisonment, he was aware that he would meet his fatal end in that prison. But while he was in prison, the good news had spread, and that's because Paul's courage was contagious. He was willing to go through great lengths and suffer great things, all for the cause of the spread of the kingdom. And that obvious willingness was inspiring to those who saw it. Here's a man who would not be stopped by prison. Wherever he went, wherever he was in one form or another preaching the good news with exceptional energy and unusual zeal. "So that it has become known to all the palace guard and to all the rest that my chains are in Messiah." So the palace guard would have been the prison guards, and they would have known that his chains are in Messiah. He was there because of his proclamation of the Messiah, but he was also there with the Messiah and in the Messiah. So the Messiah was all around him. He visits us in our suffering, and when we suffer, he suffers with us. This was made plain to Paul during his conversion in Acts 9:4. He says, "Why do you persecute me?" Paul thought he was only persecuting the church, but little did he know that the dead, crucified, false Messiah, as he once thought of him, was in fact living, and he does enter into our pains and our joys on this earth. And most of the brothers, trusting in the master because of my chains, are much more bold to fearlessly speak the word. So this is about the contagiousness of Paul's courage, his witness and example that he was willing to be lashed publicly, imprisoned, stoned to death at one point, which he miraculously survived, all for the sake of the cause which he was born and called to spread, the spreading of the good news. The great lengths that he was willing to endure had an inspiring effect on anyone, because anyone who could witness that, even if you're neutral and impartial to the good news, you cannot help but admire a man's willingness to suffer the lengths he did and to go the lengths that he did for the cause in which he was committed. Some indeed proclaim Messiah, even from envy and strife, but some also out of pleasure. So Paul, we gather, was a man who was indifferent to the motives of the messengers. What was most important to him was that the message was being spread, even if it was from impure motives. Envy, he was himself subject to criticism, and there were factions, believe it or not, who did not like him because he was a physically unimpressive man, not the most polished or eloquent preacher. He preached with simplicity, and some people thought he was too extreme in his pro-Gentile stances for existence. So he was a man subject to criticism, and so he wasn't a universally beloved figure, even in the halls of Christianity, which he, more than anyone else, helped to create and spread. The former announced Messiah from selfish ambition, not sincerely, thinking to add distress to my chains. So he's the target of their preaching. They're trying to bring unnecessary and unnatural suffering to him while he is in chains, but he has the mindset of the one who is liberated even while they are in chains. The Messiah is our liberator from the slavery of sin and death and hell. And even though these some of these preachers were proclaiming Messiah out of selfish ambition, there was no preaching for filthy lucre, preaching for the prominence of being the one who leads a church. And they were not sincere, they were not genuine, they had no integrity in doing what they did, yet the fact that they did it was enough for a man like Paul, whose every waking thought was the spread of the good news by him and by others, because we are called not only to evangelize the world, but make disciples in the Great Commission. But the latter out of love, knowing that I am appointed for the defense of the good news. So he was appointed, he was ordained by the hand of the Son himself to be his witness to the Gentiles and their kings. He was entrusted to a lot of hitherto mysterious theological revelations, which through him became known. And he was a loyal, faithful, and obedient servant. He had all the characteristics of one who could be entrusted and appointed for such a calling. What then? Only that in every way, whether in pretense or in truth, Messiah is announced, and in this I rejoice. In fact, I shall rejoice. So he has no cause for complaint, even though the men and the messengers are flawed. The fact that the message is being spread by any means necessary was enough to cause him to rejoice. And he himself was perpetually preaching. We read that he witnessed to the palace guards in the 13th verse. So he did not let a thing like having chains on him stop him from witnessing to the of the Messiah, and part of his commission is to bring it to Gentiles and their kings. So eventually he would be, in many occasions, he would brought before a trial which was presided over a king, and Paul would have the opportunity to witness to that king and the surrounding audience. For I know that this shall turn out for my deliverance through your prayer and the supply of the Spirit of Yahshua Messiah. So he has confidence that he's not going to be there forever. This is a temporary imprisonment, unlike the second full, final, and fatal one. This one, he has faith that he will see the light of day, and he's thanking them for the prayer, which in a lot of way prompts his deliverance. So deliverance is not salvation from sin, that Paul was pretty much at all times always secured of, at least in his post-conversion life. So he's speaking of deliverance from prison, where he found himself. And the book of Ephesians, Philippians, Colossians, and Philemon collectively comprise what are known as his prison epistles. These are among Paul's greatest works, largely because they are from a more mature period of his life, and also because in prison people can do their best thinking. And a lot of these treatises, Ephesians and especially, is systematic, almost semi-systematic in its presentation. According to my intense longing and anticipation that I shall not be ashamed at all, and that with all boldness as always, so now also Messiah made me great in my body, whether by life or by death. So in Romans 1:16, he says that he is not ashamed of the gospel because it is all the things he goes on to describe it of. And to have that lack of shame, to at all times and all places present it, regardless of at the risk of ridicule and rejection, requires a boldness. But as he tells Timothy, his pastoral protege, that Elohim has not given us a spirit of cowardice, but of courage. And so to be an evangelist or a witness or a disciple requires courage. And in an exemplary disciple, that courage can be contagious. And whether by living or death, here was a man who was willing to die for the cause he lived for, if it meant the spreading of that the message. And as we're eventually going to read, he weighs the respective and relative merits of life and death. For me, to live is Messiah, and to die is gain. So in other words, the Messiah was the source of his life. The Messiah lived in him, and he lived in the Messiah. He owed his life. The Messiah created life collectively with Yahweh and the Ruach Kadesh. And so his life was not his own. He was fully engaged in the cause, in the proclamation of another. And to die, because he was so engaged in that work, and it was all-consuming appetite and consumption, he was secure he had a secure assurance, which is a theological term for the certainty of salvation. So to die would be to gain, because then he would be even closer to the Messiah, who sits at the right hand of the Father, than he could be, even though he lived in him and through him and with him and by him. And if to live in the flesh is to me a fruit of work, then what shall I choose? I do not know. So this is a mystery. He doesn't have the answer at this moment in time. But he, as we read, he resolves to remain in the flesh. He embraced the martyr's calling, but not prematurely, because he was convinced that he still had work to do, and he would remain active and operant for at least 3 to 5 years after this point. So the work wasn't done. There were many times when it came close. He found himself at death's door when he was stoned to death and miraculously resurrected. So he was willing to die for this message, and he was certainly willing to live for it. So that his passion for it extended to both ends of the life and death spectrum. For I am pressed down by the two, having a desire to depart and be with Messiah, which is much better. That's why he says to die and gain is gain in the 21st verse, because he has awareness that he will be in more intimate proximity and fellowship with the presence of the Messiah, who can visit us in our temporal frames. But so this is obviously much better than the world in which he lives now. The world which awaits us is in every measure qualitatively superior to the one we now know. But Paul says, but to remain in the flesh is more necessary for your sakes. So he has the selfless mindset of a minister. It's not about him. It was never about him to begin with. It is always and only about the Messiah and others. We must, once we are fully committed to him, it is our duty and obligation and privilege and pride and joy to bring others to the same attachment and to spread the kingdom and its population on earth. And being persuaded of this, I know that I shall stay and continue with you all, for your progress in joy of faith. So Philippians is a lot more positively oriented than a lot of the other epistles addressed to specific churches. A lot of them where there were doctrinal infightings, doctrinal confusions, sexual immorality. But Philippians, there appears to be none of that which plagued other churches. This is from start to finish a positive and praiseworthy epistle, distinct from the majority of them. And he praises them for their progress. They were on the path of spiritual maturity and advancing accordingly. Even in his absence, they had made the most of what he had imparted to them, and they kept the flame and the momentum alive. That was a cause of joy for them, and their faith was admired by Paul, who was a man with an admirable faith himself. So that your boasting might overflow in Yahshua Messiah on account of me through my coming to you again. So he has the mindset that he will make it out in time and alive, and he plans on visiting them. I honestly don't know whether he historically did after this occasion in time. That's something I could have researched but didn't. But the important juxt of this passage is that their boasting should overflow. It should exude, that which exudes out of their mouth should overwhelm them, so that all in adjacent proximity can hear and respond to the message of the Messiah. And Paul planted the seed which gave them an example to do the work that needed to be done. Paul was a human being. He could not be across all these locations that he had personally founded he couldn't be at any more than one at a single time. So that necessitated the emergence of the epistle. The literary genre was born of necessity because because the assembly was pan-national since its inception. It required letters for these men who were not bound within the confines of the promised land to communicate via epistle and communicate doctrine and other truly inspired content and material. Only behave yourselves worthily of the good news of Messiah, in order that whether I come and see you or am absent, I hear about you, that you stand fast in one spirit, with one being, striving together for the faith of the good news. In other words, he's telling them to practice what they preach. They have a good message, they have a good witness, they have a good testimony. He has no way of knowing if they are living to that accordingly, or as they should. But he does have faith that they can, with a realistic awareness that there is the possibility for them to deviate, as he had seen so many people do in so many churches he had assembled. But as long as they remain united, one spirit, one being, striving together in a collective and common cause for the faith of the good news, then there is no potential for division and destruction of their cause and their witness and their mission. Without being frightened in any way by those who oppose, which to them truly is a proof of destruction, but to you of salvation, and that from Yahweh. So there all comes a time, it comes to every one of us, where we have to put our faith in not fear what others, circumstances, situations can do to me, because our faith is in Elohim, who is greater than any circumstance, situation, or enemies. And this, to not be frightened, is an act of courage, which is synonymous with faith, no more than a man can serve two masters. Can a spirit of fear and a spirit of faith simultaneously reside in the same vessel at the same time? We will meet opposition from the world. Our values are radically alien to their own in our ethos, in our spirit, and that which gives us greatest interest is not aligned with those of the carnal creatures who form the majority of the inhabitants of the world. Yet their rejection is proof that they will be damned to an eternal hell, and we will be salvation. And he reminds them, as always, that the source of our salvation is Yahweh, who makes it all possible. Because to you it has been given as a grace on behalf of Messiah, not only to believe in him, but also to suffer for his sake. So it's counterintuitive, to say the least, to consider it a species of grace, which is the unmerited favor, to suffer for his sake. And Paul eventually expounds upon this more fully, speaking of the fellowship of the suffering in the 3rd chapter 10th verse. So in other words, the Messiah enters into our pains. When we suffer with him, he suffers with us. When we suffer for him, he suffers with us, and he embraced the ultimate suffering for us. So in that sense, it is a privilege to suffer in whatever degree we can for the one who suffered, embracing a call that none of us can ever be called to perform. Having the same struggle which you saw in me, and now here to be in me. So Paul identified, he was aware of the fact that there was external opposition and persecution confronting the Philippians church, and he liked them in a brotherhood of struggle because he was imprisoned for the very witness of that which their church was established to announce and proclaim and embody. So he does somewhat allude to the fellowship of suffering, which we read of in the 10th verse of the 3rd chapter, but that's ultimately a subject for a different discussion. We may do the 3rd chapter, or we may even do beginning in the 13th verse of the 2nd chapter, which we haven't done yet. But that's all the time we have for today. I'm glad you're here. Keep coming, stay tuned, and I'll see you then. Bye-bye.